1 minute ago, Iranian missiles struck Dimona, not Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem. Dimona, the facility in the Negev desert that Israel has operated for more than 6 decades without ever officially confirming what it does. The facility that the International Atomic Energy Agency has never been permitted to inspect. The facility that every serious analyst of Middle East security has understood for 60 years to be the heart of Israel's undeclared nuclear weapons program. The facility that every Israeli and American military planner has privately listed as the single most sensitive piece of infrastructure in the entire Israeli state. Iranian ballistic missiles just hit it. The explosion was visible from cities across the Negev. The Israeli government has not issued a statement about what was struck inside the perimeter. It has not confirmed the nature of the damage. It has not told its civilian population whether what is now burning inside Dimona poses a risk to the air, the water, or the ground in the surrounding region. It has gone silent in a way that is different from every other silence it has maintained throughout this conflict, because every other silence was about military failure. The silence is about something that has no precedent in the history of this conflict, and no established playbook for how a government manages the public communication of what just happened. Iranian missiles struck the facility that contains the most sensitive nuclear infrastructure in the Middle East, and the Israeli government is not saying a word about what those missiles hit. That silence is the most alarming thing that has happened in this conflict. And understanding exactly what Dimona is, why striking it is categorically different from everything else Iran has done in this war, and what the silence of the Israeli government tells you about what is actually happening inside that perimeter right now is what this video is going to give you. In the next few minutes, I will walk you through exactly what Dimona is and what it contains, why the Israeli government has maintained official silence about it for 6 decades, and what that silence means in the context of this morning's strike. What the physical consequences of a ballistic missile strike on nuclear infrastructure can be. What the regional and global implications of Iran demonstrating it can reach Dimona are. And what this single strike means for the trajectory of a conflict that just crossed a threshold that makes everything that preceded it look like a preliminary phase. Before we get into it, thanks for watching. Your support is what keeps this going, and I genuinely appreciate every one of you here. Make sure you are subscribed and like the video so more people can follow this. Now let's get into it. To understand why the Dimona strike is different from every other strike in this conflict, you need to understand what Dimona actually is, and why Israel has spent 60 years refusing to officially acknowledge what everyone already knows about it. The Negev Nuclear Research Center near Dimona in southern Israel was constructed with French assistance beginning in the late 1950s. Israel has described the facility publicly as a research reactor used for peaceful scientific purposes. That description has been maintained with remarkable consistency across every Israeli government for 6 decades. Regardless of what political party was in power, what international pressures were applied, or what evidence was produced by outside analysts and former insiders. That the facility's purpose goes significantly beyond peaceful research. The reason for that consistency is a policy known as nuclear ambiguity. Israel neither confirms nor denies possessing nuclear weapons. It does not acknowledge the Dimona facility's weapons-related activities. It does not permit IAEA inspections of the facility, and it has maintained this position as an official state policy for 60 years because the policy serves a specific strategic purpose. Nuclear ambiguity allows Israel to possess the deterrent effect of a nuclear capability without triggering the formal international non-proliferation responses that an explicit acknowledgement would produce. If Israel officially declared itself a nuclear state, it would face sanctions, arms embargo pressures, and international legal obligations under the non-proliferation treaty framework that its current ambiguity policy avoids. The ambiguity allows the deterrent to function without the diplomatic costs of formal acknowledgement. That policy has functioned for 60 years. Iranian missiles struck the facility this morning, and the ambiguity policy is now colliding with a physical reality that ambiguity cannot manage, because what is burning inside Dimona right now is not something that Israel can describe as a peaceful research reactor accident and expect the global audience watching this conflict to accept. The Israeli government's silence is not the silence of a government that has nothing to say. It is the silence of a government that has no language available to describe what just happened. That does not either confirm what Dimona contains or describe the damage in terms that make the ambiguity policy impossible to maintain. Every word the Israeli government says about Dimona this morning is a word that either acknowledges the nuclear weapons infrastructure that decades of official policy have refused to confirm or describes damage to a peaceful research facility in terms that cannot account for why the silence following a strike on a peaceful research facility is so complete and so prolonged. There is no statement available that threads that needle. So the government has chosen silence, and that silence is telling you more about what was hit this morning than any official statement could. Now, let us talk about what the physical consequences of a ballistic missile strike on nuclear infrastructure can be, because this is the dimension of this story that is producing the most concern among the technical and scientific community watching this conflict, and that deserves honest and careful explanation. The consequences of a strike on nuclear infrastructure vary enormously, depending on what specifically is hit and what the operational status of the struck facility is at the time of the strike. A strike on a fully operational nuclear reactor that is actively generating heat through fission produces different consequences from a strike on a weapons storage facility or processing plant that handles nuclear materials in a non-operational state. The Dimona facility is believed by analysts to include several distinct infrastructure components. A research reactor that has been operational at various points in the facility's history, and that is believed to have been the production source for the plutonium used in Israel's weapons program. Reprocessing facilities that separate weapons-grade plutonium from reactor fuel, weapons assembly, and storage infrastructure, where finished nuclear devices are believed to be housed, and the supporting technical and administrative infrastructure that keeps the facility operational. What was struck this morning inside that perimeter has not been confirmed. What the operational status of the various components was at the time of the strike has not been confirmed, and the specific warheads Iran used against the Dimona target, whether they were designed to penetrate hardened underground infrastructure or to destroy surface facilities, has not been confirmed. But the fundamental physics of what can happen when a high-explosive warhead detonates in proximity to nuclear materials does not change based on what is officially confirmed or denied. Radioactive contamination from a strike on nuclear infrastructure can take multiple forms, depending on what materials are present and how the detonation interacts with them. A strike that disperses nuclear materials without triggering a nuclear chain reaction can produce radiological contamination in the immediate area and potentially downwind, depending on meteorological conditions. A strike that damages the cooling systems of an operational reactor can produce consequences that extend significantly beyond the immediate strike area as the reactor's temperature rises without the cooling capacity needed to manage it. The Israeli government knows exactly what is inside Dimona. It knows exactly what was hit. It knows exactly what the current status of the facility is. And it is not telling its civilian population in the communities surrounding Dimona in Beerva, which is the largest city in the Negev or anywhere else in Israel, what that status means for the air they are breathing and the environment they are living in. That information gap is the most immediate and most urgent consequence of the Dimona strike for Israeli civilians in the affected region. The communities surrounding Dimona have not been told to evacuate. They have not been told to shelter in place. They have not been told to seal their homes or avoid outdoor activity. They have been told nothing. And the silence that constitutes that telling of nothing is the same silence that produced the shelter guidance failures over Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in earlier strikes. A government that did not tell the civilians of Tel Aviv that their interceptor coverage had been depleted to the point where the shelter instruction was no longer backed by a functioning protective system did not tell them, because telling them was politically and operationally inconvenient. A government that did not tell the civilians of Beit Shemesh that the warning timelines had been shortened below the threshold the civil defense model required did not tell them, because the honest communication of that fact would have required acknowledging the defensive degradation the government was trying to manage quietly. A government that is not telling the civilians living near Dimona what was hit and what the current status of the facility is this morning is not telling them for the same category of reason. The information exists. The decision not to share it has been made, and the civilians living downwind of whatever is burning inside the Dimona perimeter are making decisions about their safety based on information that their government is withholding from them. The geopolitical consequences of the Dimona strike operate at a scale that exceeds anything else that has happened in this conflict, and that requires separate analysis from the immediate military and civilian protection picture. Iran has just demonstrated that it can reach Dimona, not approach it, not threaten it, reach it, put warheads inside the perimeter of the most sensitive nuclear infrastructure in the Middle East. That demonstration changes the threat calculus of every government on Earth that has nuclear infrastructure, and that is now watching Iran prove that ballistic missiles can reach and strike that infrastructure through a sophisticated layered air defense system. It changes the calculus for every government that has been treating the Iranian ballistic missile program as a regional threat that affects Israel and the Gulf states. It changes the calculus for every nuclear power that has assumed its own facilities are protected by distance, by defense, architecture, or by the assumption that striking nuclear infrastructure is a threshold no rational adversary would cross. Iran just crossed that threshold, and it crossed it against a country whose nuclear infrastructure is protected by arguably the most sophisticated and most expensive layered air defense system that has ever been deployed to protect a specific facility. The Arrow system, David's Sling, Patriot, and whatever specialized point defense assets were positioned around Dimona specifically were not sufficient to prevent Iranian ballistic missiles from reaching the facility. That outcome is not a failure of Israeli air defense relative to a normal Iranian attack. It is the result of the same systematic attrition campaign that produced the uncontested Tel Aviv and Jerusalem strikes applied to the most hardened and most specifically defended target in Israel. Iran drained the nationwide interceptor stockpile before it struck Dimona. It introduced defeat-resistant maneuvering warheads before it struck Dimona. It forced the concentration decision that aggregated Israel's remaining defensive assets before it struck Dimona. And then it struck Dimona with a salvo calibrated to the specific defensive conditions that the preceding campaign had produced. The Dimona strike is not a lucky shot by an adversary that got through defenses it did not expect to penetrate. It is the planned terminal phase of a campaign that was working toward Dimona from the beginning. Every Tel Aviv strike was preparation for this. Every Jerusalem strike was preparation for this. Every radar destroyed in the first 3 days was preparation for this. And the Israeli government that is silent this morning knew throughout the preceding weeks of this conflict that Dimona was a potential target and could not prevent the defensive degradation that made it reachable. The American response to the Dimona strike is the most consequential single decision that Washington has faced since this conflict began, and it is being made right now in the White House Situation Room. The Dimona strike is not just an attack on Israeli nuclear infrastructure. It is an attack on the assumptions that have governed American nuclear deterrence policy in the Middle East for 60 years. The assumption that Israel's nuclear capability was secure from conventional attack. The assumption that the ambiguity policy was sustainable because no adversary could realistically threaten the facility that the ambiguity policy was designed to protect. The assumption that the combination of Israeli air defense and American military backing created a deterrent environment that made a strike on Dimona strategically irrational for any adversary. All three of those assumptions failed this morning, and the administration that has been managing its involvement in this conflict within bounded escalation parameters is now facing pressure to respond to the Dimona strike in a way that the current state of American military capacity in the theater and the political will of an administration that has been trying to keep this war-bounded cannot easily accommodate. The open question that the Dimona strike leaves hanging over this conflict and over the entire global nuclear order is the one that no government is prepared to answer publicly this morning. What does Iran do next with a capability it has now proven? It demonstrated it could reach Tel Aviv. Then it demonstrated it could reach Jerusalem. Then it demonstrated it could reach both simultaneously. Now it has demonstrated it can reach the most defended nuclear facility in the Middle East. The escalation ladder that produced those four demonstrations has one more rung that nobody wants to name out loud. And the silence of the Israeli government this morning is the most honest communication about how close to that rung this conflict has now arrived that any official source is going to provide. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you being here. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If Iran's strike on Dimona was the planned terminal phase of the same systematic campaign that produced every previous uncontested strike in this conflict, what does the existence of that plan tell you about whether Iran knew from the beginning that Dimona was the destination and every Tel Aviv and Jerusalem strike was preparation for reaching it? And at what point does a government whose most sensitive nuclear facility has just been struck by Iranian ballistic missiles have an obligation to tell the civilians living downwind of that facility what was hit and what it means for their safety right now? Let me know below, subscribe, and like the video if you want to stay updated on this, and click the video on screen to see another one.